Welcome to Saltivation. The Saltivation Show is a podcast series featuring the leading voices in salt, where we talk about the issues and strategies to help you make sense of state and local tax. So, Nick, thank you so much for being here. We've been really looking forward to this conversation, as I'm sure, some of our listeners will be as well.
Thank you. Really excited to be here on Saltivation. Thanks, Meredith, and thank you, Judy, too.
All right, so we will just jump in. So can you give us a little bit of your background and how you ended up kind of where you started and how you got to kind of the cannabis industry and now getting into the psilocybin and just kind of the more maybe...
It wasn't a straight path, Meredith. It's a crooked road.
The fun stuff.
It's a crooked road to get here, I'll tell you. So I left the IRS. I was an IRS trial attorney for, 11 years or something like that. And I left the IRS right about when cannabis was becoming an industry here in Colorado in 2012 and 13. And then full legalization occurred in 14. And I got my sort of first cannabis company audit that I handled right about that time frame. I think it was a little bit before 14. And, kind of saw what was going on out there. And the IRS then targeted the cannabis industry here in Colorado. And so pretty much every cannabis company got put under audit. And pretty much that was the only audits that were going on here in Colorado at that time. And so it just became a huge part of my practice sort of because I was there at the time. And, it grew and now I've joined Greenspoon Marder, and Greenspoon Marder is a big law firm. We're an AmLaw 200 law firm with offices all over the country because the cannabis industry expanded from Colorado. It was great for me because I was there in the early days. And then with every new state, there was a new cannabis company and a new guy from Colorado there in the background somewhere. You didn't have a guy from Colorado in those days. You didn't know what you were doing. And I knew those guys from Colorado. So it worked out really well for me.
And then, you weren't worried about like the federal limitations since it's not legal federally that you would, like my husband, he worked for the state of Colorado and then he does this sort of litigation and he didn't want to do the marijuana industry because he was worried he couldn't litigate in federal court, but that you don't find to be an inhibition on your practice. You're able to silo yourself within the state so you don't get hindered from an ability to take it further because you're not really litigating cases, you're helping them get compliant, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and so early on, the state bar said, hey, you can represent cannabis clients. Even criminals get to have lawyers, by the way, and not that they are criminals, but you can't help them sort of do any forward planning.
Okay.
You can represent them with things that happened in the past. So that was the first. Oh, and as it gets more funny, that was the advice. And the other part of the advice was, and you can smoke marijuana. And then the second advice came along and they said, yeah, you can represent cannabis companies and you can actually help them comply moving forward. And you can smoke marijuana.
We just want to remind you of your ability that you will not get disbarred
right?
To support your clients in a.
But Judy, it was a little bit more dicey, I think, for CPAs because CPAs do that planning work, and then a number of CPA societies came out with guidance, and really the IRS wants the cannabis industry to use qualified CPAs and is happy to see them come into the mix. I've had a ton of cannabis industry audits, and even in the early days, when they weren't at all correct, the returns that were being done, and people were just blatantly ignoring the rules. I never ever saw a return prepare penalty or anything like that because there just was so much uncertainty out there. It wasn't appropriate.
That's interesting because a lot of the large firms I've worked for, Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, a regional firm called Eide Bailly, they all said no cannabis. We're not going in that space. And one benefit we have at Tax Ops is we're kind of the owners of the company. We can make those decisions. So we have not turned a blind eye to them either. If they need our assistance, we're here to support them. We don't do as much multi-state because everything's siloed. if that makes sense. So we have a lot of clients that serve the cannabis industry, meaning I can one of them as like the Home Depot of cannabis supplies. We have other clients in like CBD industry. So that was a kind of a game changer a few years ago. Where everyone was like, oh, GHG, it's bad. It's like, no, it's not. But they still have compliance issues and so forth. And so we're able to help them. So we've always been kind of pro cannabis, I suppose you would say, to give good advisory services, but because we weren't curtailed by that. So it's very interesting because even law firms have made those decisions of in or out. And obviously, Greenberg has not made a decision.
Yeah, and we were actually early in the space. We were all in publicly with a dedicated cannabis practice early on.
Okay.
And Judy, one thing you just said that's very interesting on the state tax side for cannabis companies and CBD companies, it's interesting. Many people would probably say that the CBD industry is actually kind of less safe in a way than the marijuana industry, because there's really no rules in the CBD industry.
Right, because it's a supplement.
Marijuana,
yeah,
robust regulations around the marijuana industry, right? And so now, this year, actually, what we're seeing in that space is that a lot of those CBD manufacturers went ahead and were doing something called Delta 8 and Delta 9, which is THC derived from hemp. And now a number of states are going back in and saying, oh, we think you're a marijuana company. Guess what tax applies to all of your sales for the past 4 years?
Right.
The marijuana tax.
Oh, boy.
And that's a big number, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now they want to apply that to the sale of hemp-derived THC as well. That's going on both in California and Colorado, and I've heard it's spreading to Florida and other states as well.
Oh, dear.
So yeah, heads up on that. That's brand new.
Well, and that's just so unfortunate. It's a legitimate business. It doesn't get business deductions. I mean, there's just so many things I think that are still wrong about how we're handling this legal industry. And now we're like going after it more for classification issues when there's no, alternative substance in a THC.
Going back to like a penalties, because some of those kind of marijuana taxes are up to like 20-30%, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not, and hit with excise taxes and whatnot, they're not cheap, for lack of a better.
They're oftentimes 30%. I mean, I think the average one is around that number. And there might be a 10% production excise tax and a 15% sales tax, adding up to 25 to 30%, depending on what state you're in. But yeah, and then you look back and you do a 3-year, 4-year calculation of that tax on the sales of hemp nationwide. And boy, that's a big number, right? So, and of course they did schedule Delta 8 as a controlled substance, and I believe Delta 9 as well. So it was scheduled as a federal controlled substance. Judy, was that a month or so ago, a month and a half ago? Not too long ago, It was listed.
Yeah, that's some scary stuff, honestly, I just feel such empathy for these people getting into this space. And it's such a good curative space. It's so good for the body and all the things have been proven. Charlotte's Web is a client of ours, and they got the Sanjay Gupta, green light. I mean, it was just all kinds of wonderful things. And I think so many people are benefiting from these products to deal with stress and anxiety, kind of like the Soma from 1984 and saving lives. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And here comes psilocybin, right,
There
Meredith?
we go. There's the transition that I was going to make is just, because Colorado decriminalized the possession of mushrooms, psilocybin, 2 or 3 years ago?
Denver did.
Denver did. And maybe that's where I confused, because that's where I reside and voted on favorably. And then this past year, voted. Was this also a Denver thing, or just a state thing for
statewide,
the ability to kind of use it at home, not sell or distribute kind of. So can you kind of walk us through what some of the changes are, or what some of the rules are associated with mushrooms that Colorado has done, and where you think maybe some of that interplay to kind of the regulations that have been in place, certainly in Colorado for 10 years are associated with cannabis, how that's going to kind of carry over into the mushroom space?
Well, the rules are still being written in the mushroom space. It looks to us like it's sort of less, retail and more medical, which is good for the industry if that allows them to be profitable, because it starts to align with a case out there in the marijuana space called Champ, rather than subsequent cases that found that all the activities of a cannabis related enterprise were subject to a code section called 280E, rather than just the specific area where the sale of marijuana was occurring. And what section 280E is a code section that, I'll try to paraphrase it here. It's pretty short. It basically says that there are no deductions or credits allowed for trafficking in a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substance. Psilocybin and MDMA and the various drugs that were legalized here in Colorado are still federal controlled substances. And so, 280E would still apply to that business. And the extent to which it applies is still an open question. There's a lot of therapy activity that goes on in or should go on in those new businesses that are coming along. And that case I mentioned, Champ, is a case involving an AIDS clinic in San Francisco in the really early days. And that AIDS clinic was a legitimate medical facility, and they started selling marijuana, because it worked, and so the court held that it was only the portion of that. It was a single company too. Only the portion of the company that was for the sale of marijuana was subject to Section 280E,
Right.
and the rest of it was not. But in the cannabis space, there hasn't been a case that's happened since where the court has ruled along those same lines, despite things other than the sale of marijuana that goes on in dispensaries. And that's mainly because dispensaries are so limited in what they can and can't do in a lot of ways. And psilocybin's different. Psilocybin has this heavy duty, important therapy mode to it that I think starts to align it closer to the Champ facts. That said, they need good lawyers to make sure that they are, setting up the right, structure and relationship and all of those things to qualify for that.
Right, because don't you bifurcate operations a little bit? Like you would want to have separate legal entities so you could benefit not lose the benefit of 280E. So you would want to do certain things operationally to separate the cost so that you could get valid deductions except for on the one component. Is that what you see a lot of advice around, like that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I think that's probably right. It could depend though on right now it's Oregon and Colorado, and the models, we're not sure how similar or dissimilar they're going to be. And can you separate them? Does this therapy have to be provided by the company that's selling the psilocybin as well? And so there's some questions around that, I think, still, Judy. But you're spot on with that. Certainly, it's better to have that in a separate company than in the same company. Although that wasn't what Champ was, so I don't think it's required. But I think it's better too.
Well, especially there is in theory, right, the possibility of less kind of commingling of, kind of
Sure.
duality behind, if you think of it like a cost seg, like how much of your electric bill is used for growth versus, the accounting department over cubicles.
Yeah, so you allocate costs like that, and it really goes. So there's that part of it, and then there's the really, it's kind of the hobby loss rules, the Section 183 rules, as to whether that other business is a separate business. So and that requires profit motive, right? Realistic profit motive. And the problem with a lot of the cannabis cases was that they put so many expenses on the other non-280E company that it could never make a profit. So it was found to be not a legitimate company and merely just part of the cannabis company. And again, that's because they're so limited. The only other thing they can sell are bongs and t-shirts. We call it glass and t-shirts. And that's not a viable business. And it's such a small piece of what people are coming to dispensaries for, that the courts have pretty much held that part is merely ancillary to the sale of marijuana. But psilocybin space is way different. It seems like the psilocybin itself is a really small part. It's really the therapy that's the big part of it. And Meredith, I'm kind of an old guy, and I like to know kind of what the the cool kids are saying, what are they calling it? Are they calling it smoke? Are they calling it weed? So I'm doing that. I'm doing that in the psilocybin space as well. And I tell you, they're still calling weed the flame or the fire. That's still good. That's still good speak. I don't know if anybody's calling it the kind or anything like that anymore. Certainly nobody's calling it grass. But the newest I hear is lit. They're saying it's lit. So you're like, oh man, that was lit. That's like I understand that's the new phrase. And in the psilocybin space, I got two terms for you. If we're going to do this, we got to know what they're talking about,
Fair.
right? And the first term is the stack. And so a lot of psilocybin that's being produced these days, and yes, it's happening, they will have a list of the different kinds of mushrooms that are in it. And it's not just the psilocybin. They want to put what are known as functional mushrooms in as well. And they call that then the stack, right? And then the other thing I'm hearing from folks in Oregon actually is that and probably this is more than just Oregon, but is when you take there's just two different kinds of ways to do it, right? You can microdose psilocybin, and then you can take a huge dose, and the huge dose is more of the therapy model, I understand, although I don't know if that's true or not, but that huge dose now is called the hero dose, I understand.
Ooh, I like it. Stack and hero. Okay.
Yeah, right.
I was just thinking, I have this book on mushrooms at the side of my bed that I was just reading. And then I just read this book from my book club. And it's about these people like that ingest mushrooms and it makes them live forever. And then they transfer their body to the next person. It's a very interesting book. Very gloomy because it's about mushrooms that are like it dark. Anyway, so I'm like, oh, I should go get those and then put them on here and show them. You can learn about this stuff because there are like millions of mushrooms out there too. Like millions.
Oh, they're everywhere. Yeah, they're everywhere.
And during COVID, I got through COVID. I watched this thing called Fabulous Fungi. It's a documentary about how bad we thought mushrooms were. And there are so many good palliative reasons for them. And I'm like, oh my God. And then they connect the earth, like, because they grow in the ground and then they come out and they kind of clean up the world. And you're like, they just do so many wonderful things for our bodies and nature. So anyway.
Yeah, I even heard that with the way that we do our gardens at home, we shouldn't till the whole bed because we disturb that. What's it called? It's called the mycelium. We disturb the mycelium layer, which is the sort of mushroom layer beneath the surface that is used by plants then to communicate that they need resources. And this is the story goes. And so the plants actually send signals through the mycelium, and then the mycelium will deliver nutrients and things back to the plants. Or so one of the books I read said. And then I saw another thing the other day where they said, yeah, you should, when you're tilling your soil, don't till the whole thing because you disrupt the mycelium layer. Just go ahead and till where you're going to put the plant itself and just do that so the mycelium then stays intact around those small areas.
Who knew?
So much useful information here, Judy.
I'm telling you. And now we're going to learn even more about it. That's what's the cool thing. Like now it's legalized. You're going to see more. It's good.
Yeah.
Maybe en route to being legalized.
Yeah. Well, I was going to just add Freakies, which is right by my house, smoke shop and tattoo parlor, I guess. So they sell bongs, pipes, vaporizers, oil rigs, and whatever you got in that whole space. So obviously that's been a viable business somehow, some way. I don't know how many bongs one human needs, but I guess, there is businesses that have been supporting this industry, even though before it was legal, because that shop
they were tobacco
20, 30 years. Yeah, it must have been. Yeah, it's kind of funny.
Well, I've always felt that would be a good model to start a cannabis company in. You just create a little window in the back and a safe space back there. And now your whole facility is already a profit venture. And now just this little piece is subject to 280E. So far, I haven't seen anybody do that, but I've always thought that'd be a good method.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that either.
This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended, nor should it be relied upon as legal, tax, accounting, or investment advice. You should consult with a competent professional to discuss specifics of your situation and the applicability of the information presented.